Have you ever felt lost trying to figure out the difference between psychology, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, and psychiatry? You're not alone. Many people struggle to understand these terms, but when it comes to choosing a mental health professional, the problem becomes real. On top of that, we often hear conflicting opinions. Mainstream psychology claiming that psychoanalysis isn't scientific or effective. Yet many people swear it changed their lives. So what's the truth? Is psychoanalysis a legitimate form of therapy? Or is it a sophisticated illusion? I will try to figure it out in this video. But you may ask, wait, you're a philosopher and not a psychologist. Why your opinion matters? And it's true, I am a philosopher. However, I actually read classical psychoanalysis as a part of my philosophical education. And I am also proficient in general methodology of sciences and philosophy of science. Assessing the validity of psychoanalysis within a scientific framework seems to fall within my area of expertise, the Genesis of Psychotherapy. The term psychology originates from the Greek psyche, so soul, and logos, meaning study or language. So the meaning of psychology is literally the study of the soul. Modern psychotherapy emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, pioneered by Sigmund Freud, Alfred Adler, and Carl Jung. Their work led to the formation of the three Viennese schools of psychotherapy. Freud introduced concepts like the unconscious mind, repression, and psychosexual development. Adler emphasized the inferiority complex and social interest, while Jung developed theories on the collective unconscious and archetypes. Despite historical significance, contemporary psychological science move beyond these early frameworks. Freud's theories, for example, have been criticized for their lack of falsifiability, excessive focus on sexual development, and very weak empirical foundation. Empirical, so based on observation and experiments. Modern neuroscience has failed to validate many of his claims about the mind. Likewise, Jung's mystical approach and Adler's teleological framework, while philosophically intriguing, lack any evidential support. Freud's theories, once revolutionary, now constitutes one of the most discredited systems in modern psychology, as his approach relied on several flawed premises. That psychological symptoms stem primarily from repressed memories, often sexual in nature. Dreams contain disguised wish fulfillments, requiring expert interpretation. Human development follows universal psychosexual stages. Freud's evidence was based almost entirely on case studies from his own practice, with interpretations imposed on patients rather than derived from independent observation. The concept of repressed memories has been particularly harmful, as research demonstrates that memories are particularly malleable and suggestible, leading to the creation of false memories rather than uncovering the trauma. Furthermore, Freud also committed many methodological mistakes. For example, he refused to revise his theories given contradictory evidence, so violating the scientific principle of falsifiability. While his recognition of unconscious processes was significant, his specific mechanism and therapeutic techniques have not withstood scientific scrutiny. So some time ago, I actually read a biography of Carl Jung. And before, I was aware of his psychoanalysis, although I wasn't fully aware of his methodological assumptions, let's say. As Jung used to use his dreams as revelations that he used to create his theories. Well, it's not very scientific, isn't it? So Jung's analytical psychology actually blends his observations as a clinical psychiatrist with pseudoscientific speculation. For example, his concept of the collective unconscious, so a supposed repository of collective archetypes, lacks credible neurobiological or evolutionary explanations. His approach used to combine mysticism, astrology, alchemy, and various spiritual traditions, without subjecting them to scientific validation. For example, his notion of synchronicity, so like meaningful coincidences that you can observe in your life. It explicitly rejected causality, so a fundamental principle of scientific inquiry. Ultimately, Jung's work mostly aligns with mythology and weird philosophy than psychology, at least scientific psychology. Because in today's landscape of psychology, we can see a clear division on humanistic and empirical psychology. Empirical psychology includes cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and other evidence-based treatments. These approaches emphasize measurable outcomes, standardized protocols, and scientific validation through controlled studies. Psychoanalytic and humanistic psychology focuses on subjective experience, meaning-making, and the therapeutic relationship, rather than symptom reduction alone. Of course, psychoanalysis can be placed within humanistic psychology, and it has been widely criticized for its lack of empirical support, inefficiencies compared to other therapies, and resistance to scientific scrutiny. Unlike evidence-based approaches, psychoanalytic theories remain largely unfalsifiable, and they lack rigorous validation by some evidence. So lack of empirical validation seems to be the strongest argument against psychoanalysis, as it fails to meet scientific standards. And we live in science-oriented society. For example, concepts such as unconscious mind or defense mechanism are difficult to test in controlled studies. Unlike cognitive behavioral therapy, which relies on measurable outcomes, psychoanalysis depends on subjective interpretation. And there are, of course, many studies on that, which highlight that psychoanalysis has not demonstrated consistent, replicable evidence supporting its core principles, which is a very strong claim. And there are also studies that represent a limited efficacy compared to other therapies. For example, in this meta-analysis, we see that long-term psychodynamic therapy lacks strong empirical support, particularly when compared to structured and short-term interventions such as cognitive behavioral therapy. Psychodynamic therapy doesn't present superior results, and it's often less effective than science-based therapies. And in this paper, we can observe the resistance to scientific scrutiny, as psychoanalysis has historically evolved based on internal philosophical developments rather than external validation. This research underscores its disconnect from the scientific method, raising concerns about its continued credibility as a therapeutic approach. As we said before, it's also inferior to cognitive behavioral therapy, as here we can see that it's significantly more effective in treating depression and anxiety. It consistently outperforms psychoanalysis in symptom reduction, treatment efficiency, and long-term outcomes. Cognitive behavioral therapy's structured nature allows for measurable progress, while psychoanalysis often lacks clear treatment goals and timelines. There's also a practical argument that psychoanalysis is most usually more time-consuming and expensive, as traditional psychoanalysis requires years of therapy, with frequent sessions and significant financial commitment. And still, its outcomes remain uncertain. This research highlights the high cost and long duration of psychoanalytic treatment, and it raises also ethical and accessibility concerns in mental health care. Because, if for the same cost we can treat 10 patients rather than 1 patient, we should invest in the cheaper solution if it's more effective. It's very reasonable. In summary, psychoanalysis fails to meet contemporary scientific standards. While historically significant, its theoretical foundations are very weak. And as we can see, its effectiveness is questionable compared to more scientific approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy. As psychology advances, psychoanalysis continues to decline in favor of treatments with measurable, validated benefits. A very troubling aspect of psychoanalysis is its lack of standardization, as unlike empirically supported treatments, which adhere to strict methodological guidelines, psychoanalytic schools vary widely in their interpretations and applications. Freudian classical analysis to Lacanian psychoanalysis, Jungian therapy, and object relations theory, psychoanalysis exists as a fragmented discipline with little consensus of fundamental concepts. But maybe everything doesn't have to be scientific. Because, there are people that claim that psychoanalysis helped them. And maybe people that choose psychoanalysis just have different goals that are not measurable with the same metrics as more scientific approaches. Because cognitive behavioral therapy is mostly used when someone has a mental health problem. And some people choose psychoanalysis just because they want to know themselves, which is philosophically false and methodologically very weak. Because, there is no core that you can more know about. in yourself, at least according to contemporary theories of personal identity. So the problem remains when someone chooses psychoanalysis, for example, to treat real psychological problems, like for example problems with anxiety or depression, because through science we know that they are better, faster, more effective, and cheaper. And scientific psychology also has its own problems. There is so-called replication crisis, the crisis that emerges from the fact that many famous psychological experiments have failed to be replicated, which questions many different findings in today's psychology, findings that were used to create reliable psychological theories. This doesn't, however, equal scientific psychology with psychoanalysis. And one of the most famous examples is so-called Stanford prison experiments created by Zimbardo. There's so much literature on that. As it turns out, methodologically it was incredibly flawed. It shouldn't even be called an experiment, actually. And yet many people still cite that experiment, including people in academia, stating many strong claims about human nature, that our decisions are almost completely determined by the outside, which is not necessarily 100% true, at least not given this experiment, which wasn't even an experiment. But there are some real problems. How to measure that psychoanalysis actually works? Because in nature is of course incredibly subjective, and only qualitative studies could verify that. And we can't always know whether cognitive behavioral therapy for a given case could have been better, because we have differences in the ways that the outcome should be measured between more humane approach and scientific approach. They are just different in their nature. Also, an argument in favor of psychoanalysis is that the number one important thing in a therapy is therapeutic relation. And the school of psychoanalysis of psychotherapy seems to be much less important. But if we compare having a relation, therapeutic relation with a therapist, when in one case it's scientific and in the second case it's not scientific, then given the evidence that we have, you have higher probability of finishing your therapy earlier. This therapy will be more effective if it's evidence-based therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy. So yeah, psychoanalysis can be helpful too, but your odds are better if you use scientific approach. And there is one interesting example that I want to talk about. It's an example of use of psychoanalysis in philosophy. And I'm talking here about one of the most famous living philosopher, Slavoj Žižek. He combines psychoanalysis with Marxism and Hegelism, which is, well, very original. It's really hard to assess his philosophy as it's anti-substantial in its nature, as it consists mostly of metaphors and interpretations of various events and cultural phenomena in spite of social Marxist theory or Lacanian psychoanalysis. Jacques Lacan was a psychoanalyst that was very influential in the 20th century. He was actually a student of Freud, and he developed his own theory of psychoanalysis. He combined Freudian approach with structuralism and tried to even mathematize his psychoanalysis. But from logical or mathematical perspective, it has almost no sense, at least to logicians and mathematicians that I talked to. And it's actually, in my opinion, one of the most wildest psychoanalysis there. I mean, it's interesting to read actually, but there is no good reason to believe in it. So the templates that Žižek uses to comment on reality and cultural events isn't scientific at all. And it's methodologically incredibly weak, as it's not even logically consistent. So what value it can have actually? Well, there has to be some value if he's so popular. I mean, his theories are sometimes funny. And actually I spent some time reading his works, and it was good time. But I treat them as just stories and not philosophical or scientific theories. These are just comments on reality that sometimes may spark some creativity in you and make you more reflective towards reality. So I would like to share some tips that I had from a professor of psychology. These are tips about mental health in general, because the map of different schools of therapies is incredibly broad. And for a person that is not a psychologist, so for the majority of people, it's very hard to orient it in this map. So he said that we should treat our mental health like our general health. So no, there's no need to go to a doctor with a simple cut or a simple cold. Similarly with a therapist. There is no need to seek a therapist if you're just feeling sad, because, it's a normal emotion that everyone feels time to time. But if your symptoms become persistent, or they are returning frequently, or maybe they are worrying because you have never seen those symptoms before. So anytime you're concerned about your health or about your mental health, that's the time to seek a specialist. So how do we usually choose a medical professional? Well, we go to a physician, so a general doctor. We don't choose a cardiologist or a pulmonologist on our own, because we don't have a specialized knowledge about health. Similarly, with mental health, it's not wise to choose a school of psychotherapy on our own, because we are not trained in psychology. If you choose a psychoanalyst because you are sometimes feeling anxious, you might end up in the cycle of 5-year therapy. That won't necessarily be very helpful also. So what should we do? So we should visit a general psychologist, for example, a clinical psychologist that can assess our symptoms and tell us what we actually need, what kind of therapy we need. Or maybe we shouldn't seek a therapist, but a psychiatrist. Therefore, we should treat our mental health similarly to our general health. And it's similarly advisable not to wait with concerning symptoms. While psychoanalysis has historical and philosophical significance, it fails as a scientific discipline due to its lack of empirical validation, resistance to scrutiny, and very subjective methodologies. Evidence-based therapies, like, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, offer more reliable, effective, and scientifically supported treatments for mental health conditions. But you always have a choice. If you want to experiment with psychoanalysis, go for it. But if you are generally worried about your mental health, in our society that is dominated by science, you should choose scientific approach and not wait until it's too late. As many branches of our lives today are divided, or science and pseudoscience, or simply not science, it's similar with psychology, as we can see. And that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to give me a like or a subscription if you want to see more content like this in the future. Let me know in the comment section, what do you think about psychoanalysis and different schools of psychotherapy? Are you interested in that topic? Or maybe you are a psychologist? Okay, once again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.